Teach Legal. I wanted to jump on here really quick and talk about another Fourth Amendment case that the Supreme Court just recently heard oral arguments on, and they'll probably decide it beginning of next year sometime, probably sometime in February. This is the case coming out of Arizona that's entitled Torres versus Madrid. And this is a case where there's an unsuccessful attempt by the police officers to detain a suspect, and whether or not that unsuccessful attempt is a seizure within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. This will be an interesting case because we know that the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, but you have to get to a seizure in order to trigger the Fourth Amendment's protections. And that's what the crux of this case is about. What happened was two officers approached this truck late at night or early in the morning, and it was parked in a driveway or a parking spot, and the engine was running, and they approached the car, and the driver, in fear of or thinking she was going to be carjacked or robbed, pulls out and pulls away and drives away. And the officers, thinking that they're in danger, they fire some shots into the car. They shoot the victim in the torso a couple of times. She subsequently drives about 75 miles to a hospital, checks herself in, and then the next day she's arrested. Now, she files a civil rights lawsuit asserting that she was unreasonably seized against the Fourth Amendment via being shot a couple of times, and therefore she is seeking to prove her civil case. The police are saying, well, she wasn't really seized because she didn't stop. And that's where the crux of this case comes in at. So it'd be interesting to see how the court handles this case. Now, the court is going to rely on a case called California versus O'Dari. I believe it's a 1991 case where the court basically said in that case that a person being chased by an officer is not actually seized until caught. However, there's a caveat in that language, and Justice Scalia talks about the caveat where he says, quote, the word seizure bears the meaning of laying of hands on somebody or the application of physical force to restrain movement, even when it's ultimately unsuccessful. So what that means is, you don't have to actually detain someone for it to be a seizure if you lay hands or you apply force. I mean, that's what the plaintiffs are contending in this case. I think the factual issue is whether or not being shot twice constitutes a seizure. I would argue that the Supreme Court is going to find this a seizure, but is not going to find that always using physical force to detain someone who ultimately gets away is not a seizure. This is an extreme case, being shot twice in the torso. I mean, I think when you're shot, it's in my personal view, it's reasonable to believe that you were seized for purposes of triggering the Fourth Amendment. This would be an interesting case to see, because if the court were to determine that in all cases where you're physically detained and ultimately the person gets away is never a seizure, that will have a very big impact on the applicability of the Fourth Amendment seizure provisions. So it'd be interesting to see how the court will rule in this case. After the oral arguments, it appears like this case may go 3 justices finding a seizure in this case, 3 justices finding there was not a seizure, and maybe the Chief Justice Roberts and or Justice Kavanaugh will tip the favor into one way or the other, depending on how they go. You really were not able to ascertain their position from their questions during the oral argument. So keep your eye out on this case, the Torres versus Madrid case, on what constitutes a seizure, which would ultimately implicate the Fourth Amendment if it determines that shooting someone twice is a seizure, or it will, make the burden of claiming unreasonable search and seizure very hard if they determine that shooting someone twice is not a seizure if the person ultimately gets away. Again, this is Sean with Teach Legal, and I'll see you next time.